He ordered a wife the way he ordered winter flour out of grim necessity, expecting nothing but utility and a sack that wouldn't tear. Wyatt wanted a cook-amender a body to keep the killing frost out of his marrow. He expected silence. He expected cold, practical compliance. What he got was a woman who smelled of black powder and crushed sage, carrying a gaze sharp enough to flay him alive. She didn't just thaw his frozen existence. She burned it to the ground. The straight razor scraped against Wyatt's jaw with the coarse sound of a shovel hitting gravel. He paused, wiping a mixture of cheap lye soap and his own blood on a rag that smelled faintly of bear grease. His hands calloused to the point of feeling like cured leather were entirely unsuited for the delicate work of making himself presentable. He nicked his chin again. He cursed, dropping the razor into the tin basin with a sharp clatter. Presentable. The word felt like a burr in his boot. Wyatt stared into the cracked piece of mirror nailed to the log wall. He looked exactly like what he was, a man who had spent the last 7 years talking more to mules and trapped pelts than human beings. His hair was the color of wet bark, his skin weathered into deep, permanent lines around his eyes from squinting into the high country sun. He tugged at the collar of the stiff cotton shirt he had bought 3 years ago and worn twice. It felt like a hangman's noose. He didn't want to go down the mountain. He didn't want a wife. But the winter of '82 had nearly killed him, a compound fracture in his leg, a fire that wouldn't catch, and 3 days of delirium, where he had dragged himself across the dirt floor just to eat snow. He needed an insurance policy against the brutal isolation. He needed someone to boil the water and keep the hearth lit if he was dragged in bleeding. So he had sent a letter, $50, and a stark description of his life to a matrimonial agency in St. Louis. I live high up. It is cold. The work is hard. If you are afraid of the dark, do not come. He hitched the team. The mules, Jasper and Clementine, blew plumes of white steam into the freezing morning air. The harness leather was stiff with cold smelling of neat's foot oil and old sweat. Wyatt climbed onto the wagon seat, the frozen wood biting through his wool trousers, and snapped the reins. The ride down to the valley settlement of Copper Creek took 4 hours. The silence of the timberline slowly gave way to the irritating noises of civilization, the distant ringing of a blacksmith's hammer, the barking of a mangy dog, the shouting of men unloading freight. Wyatt hated it immediately. The air down here smelled wrong, thick with coal smoke, horse manure, and unwashed bodies pressed too close together. The stagecoach was already at the depot. Wyatt tied off the mules and stood by the boardwalk, his massive shoulders hunched against the biting wind. He felt entirely conspicuous. He watched the passengers disembark. A traveling salesman in a bowler hat, a prospector coughing up a lung, and then her. Her name, according to the single letter he had received in return, was Cora. She didn't look like the illustration in the agency's catalogue. There were no rosy cheeks, no delicate lace, framing a timid smile. Cora stepped down from the carriage with a heavy, ungraceful thud. She wore a drab, dark brown wool coat that had seen better decades and a hat pinned ruthlessly to hair the color of rusted iron. She looked exhausted, pale beneath a layer of road dust, but her posture was entirely rigid. Wyatt walked toward her. His boots hit the boardwalk with heavy, deliberate thuds. He stopped 3 feet away. The smell of her hit him not lavender or rose water, but the sharp tang of lye soap, old paper, and the bitter dust of 1,000 miles of trail. "You Cora?" he asked. His voice was gravelly, unused to forming words. She didn't flinch at his tone. She turned her head, and he felt the physical impact of her eyes. They were a pale, washed-out grey, like the sky right before a blizzard breaks. They held absolutely no illusion, no romance, and no fear. "I am," she said. Her voice was raspy dry as a corn husk. "You are Wyatt. You look exactly as unpleasant as your letter suggested." A strange, uncomfortable jolt hit Wyatt's chest. He didn't know what he had expected: tears, maybe fright at his size, a simpering demand for a hot bath. He didn't expect to be assessed and categorized so bluntly. He felt a sudden irrational flash of anger. "Trunk," he grunted, pointing to the top of the stage. The green one with the broken brass latch. He didn't offer his hand. He didn't offer a welcoming platitude. He bypassed her entirely, hauling the heavy, battered trunk off the coach with a grunt of exertion. It was heavier than it looked. Books, maybe. He dragged it to the wagon and threw it in the back. When he turned around, she was already standing by the wagon wheel, waiting. "It's a 4-hour ride," he said, not looking at her as he climbed up. "It's going to freeze." Cora grabbed the side of the wagon, her knuckles white, and hauled herself up onto the seat beside him. She didn't wait for his help. She settled into the hard wood, pulling her thin coat tighter around her throat. "Then I suggest you stop talking and drive the mules," she said, staring straight ahead at the mountains. Wyatt's jaw tightened. He snapped the reins over the mules' backs with more force than necessary. The wagon lurched forward. He had wanted a silent, compliant ghost to haunt his cabin and cook his meals. Looking at the rigid, dusty profile of the woman beside him, he realized with a sinking dread that he had imported a storm. The ascent was brutal. The temperature dropped 10 degrees for every hour they climbed. The mud of the valley floor gave way to ruts frozen solid as iron, and the wagon wheels jarred and slammed against the earth, vibrating straight up Wyatt's spine. He glanced sideways at Cora. She had been silent for 2 hours. Her lips were entirely bloodless, tinged with an ugly blue. She was shivering not in small, delicate tremors, but in violent, involuntary spasms that shook her entire frame. Yet she kept her jaw locked, her eyes fixed on the impenetrable wall of pine trees ahead. Guilt, unfamiliar and wholly unwelcome, pricked at the back of Wyatt's neck. He cursed under his breath, reached behind the seat with one hand, and dragged up a massive, uncured buffalo robe. It smelled fiercely of dirt, old blood, and animal musk. He threw it roughly across her lap. "Put that over your head," he muttered. Cora flinched as the heavy hide landed on her, her nose wrinkling at the pungent stench. For a second he thought she might refuse it out of pride. But survival won. She pulled the heavy fur up to her chin, burying her cold, stiffened hands in the woolly mass. "Thank you," she managed to say through chattering teeth. "Don't thank me." He snapped his eyes on the treacherous road. "If you freeze to death before we get there, I'm out $50. It was a cruel thing to say. He knew it the moment the words left his mouth. It was a defense mechanism, a way to keep the distance absolute. He waited for her to cry or to snap back. Instead, he heard a sound that made the hair on his arms stand up. She laughed. It was a short, bitter sound entirely devoid of humor, but it was a laugh. "Practical," she murmured into the buffalo fur. "I can work with practical." They reached the clearing just as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks, plunging the world into a bruised, freezing twilight. Wyatt's cabin sat squat and ugly against the tree line, built of massive, unpeeled logs. There were no curtains, no flower boxes. It was a fortress against the wild, nothing more. Wyatt hopped down his bad leg, aching fiercely from the cold and the ride. He tied off the mules and began unhitching them. He expected Cora to wait for him to help her down. He expected her to wait to be invited inside. He was wrong again. By the time he got the mules into the lean-to and walked back to the wagon to fetch her trunk, she was already on the ground. She was standing on the small, warped porch, pushing the heavy oak door open. Wyatt hauled the trunk onto his shoulder and followed her inside. The cabin was freezing the air, stagnant. It smelled heavily of wood ash, unwashed wool, and old bacon grease. In the dim light, the chaos of his solitary life was starkly exposed. Traps hung from the rafters. A pile of bloody, half-scraped beaver pelts dominated the corner. The table was cluttered with dirty tin plates and a rusted Winchester rifle. He dropped the trunk with a loud thud, suddenly acutely aware of the squalor. He felt a hot flush of shame immediately buried beneath a thick layer of defensive anger. Let her see it. Let her see exactly what she signed up for. Cora stood in the center of the room. She didn't drop her bag. She didn't take off her hat. She slowly turned in a circle, her grey eyes taking in the blood, the dirt, the rust. Wyatt walked over to the stone hearth, striking a match to the kindling he had laid that morning. "It ain't a mansion," he said to her back, his voice harsh. "I told you it was hard." "You didn't mention it was a slaughterhouse," she replied. Wyatt stood up the flames, catching the dry pine with a sharp crackle. He turned to face her, towering over her by a foot, letting his size act as intimidation. "I catch things. I skin them. That pays for the flour and the coffee. If you got a weak stomach, the wagon is still outside." Cora finally turned to look at him. The firelight flickered across her face, highlighting the sharp angles of her cheekbones and the dark circles of exhaustion under her eyes. She didn't back away from his height. She didn't cower from his temper. She set her small travel bag on the one clean chair in the room. She unpinned her hat, setting it aside, and unbuttoned her drab coat. "My stomach is fine, Wyatt," she said evenly. She walked past him close enough that he could smell that sharp, soapy scent again, and stopped at the cluttered table. She picked up the dirty tin plates, stacking them with a loud clatter. "But if I'm going to cook your meals, you are going to move those rotting pelts out of my kitchen." Wyatt stared at her, genuinely thrown off balance. His chest felt tight, a strange mixture of outrage and something entirely unnameable pulling at his ribs. He was the law up here. He was the mountain. "They need to cure," he argued, his voice a low rumble. "They can cure in the shed," Cora countered, picking up his Winchester and holding it out to him. "And guns don't go on the dining table. Take it." He looked at the rifle in her hands. He looked at the hard, uncompromising set of her jaw. For a long, tense moment, the only sound in the cabin was the snapping of the fire and the wind howling against the logs outside. Slowly feeling completely absurd, Wyatt reached out and took the rifle. Cora nodded once, a brief, businesslike motion. "Good. Now, where is the bucket? If I have to clean this floor, I need hot water." Wyatt stood, frozen by the hearth, watching her tie an apron over her travel-stained dress. He had bought a servant to make his life easier. But as she began violently scrubbing the grease from his table, he realized he had invited a profound disruptive force into his sanctuary. The absolute dead silence of his life was gone. And as he watched the firelight catch the rust-red strands of her hair, a terrifying thought crossed his mind. He wasn't entirely sure he wanted the silence back. Wyatt woke to a sound that did not belong in his cabin. It was the rhythmic metallic scrape of a heavy iron skillet moving across the stovetop. He lay rigid on the pallet of cured bear skins he had dragged near the hearth, staring up at the soot-stained rafters. For 7 years the first sounds of his morning had been the wind rattling the ill-fitting door, the stamping of the mules in the lean-to, and the popping of his own stiff joints. Now there was the hiss of water hitting hot grease. He threw off the heavy wool blanket, the icy morning air biting instantly through his long johns. He dragged his hand down his face, feeling the rough stubble he had missed with the razor yesterday. The cabin smelled entirely foreign. The sharp, acrid stench of old blood and damp fur was gone, replaced by the scent of chicory coffee, burning pine, and frying salt pork. Wyatt stood, pulling on his heavy trousers and cold boots in grim silence. He didn't look toward the kitchen corner until he was fully dressed. Cora was already wearing her apron. Her rusted iron hair was pulled back in a severe practical knot, though a few unruly strands had escaped to cling to her damp forehead. She was working the massive cast-iron stove with the frantic, jerky movements of someone entirely unaccustomed to its temperamental drafts. The heat in the small cabin was already suffocating, a stark contrast to the freezing temperatures outside. "You're burning the meat!" Wyatt rasped, his voice thick with sleep and irritation. Cora jumped her shoulders, snapping up toward her ears. She whirled around the long iron fork in her hand, looking momentarily like a weapon. Her pale grey eyes locked onto him, wide for a fraction of a second, before narrowing back into their default state of guarded hostility. The damper is rusted open. She shot back, turning her attention to the sizzling pan. It drafts like a wind tunnel. I'm doing the best I can with a stove that belongs in a scrapyard. Wyatt walked over his heavy boots, making the floorboards groan. He didn't ask for permission. He reached over her shoulder, his massive, calloused hand dwarfing hers, and slammed the heel of his palm against a lever on the side of the stovepipe. With a screech of metal on metal, the damper slid shut. The roaring fire instantly settled into a low, manageable hum. He didn't step back right away. He was close enough to feel the heat radiating off her skin, close enough to smell the harsh, lye soap she had used on her neck. It made the hairs on his arms stand up. She didn't retreat either. She stood perfectly still, her spine stiff, refusing to cower from his proximity. "Breakfast is on the table," she said, her voice tight. Wyatt grunted, stepping away. The sudden absence of her body heat left him feeling strangely unbalanced. He sat at the table, which was aggressively uncomfortably clean, and stared at the tin plate. Biscuits slightly charred on the bottom, but flaky on top. Salt pork cooked until it was brittle. Coffee that looked thick enough to float a horseshoe. He ate with the desperate, ugly efficiency of a man used to freezing his food half the time. He chewed loudly, staring at the scarred wood of the table. He could feel her watching him from the stove. It made his skin itch. He was a solitary predator suddenly trapped in a cage with a very observant bird. "I need water," she announced, suddenly breaking the heavy silence. "The bucket is empty. I need to boil your filthy clothes." Wyatt swallowed a dry lump of biscuit. "Creek's out back, 30 yards past the tree line. You'll need the heavy axe to break the ice." He expected her to ask him to do it. It was back-breaking work in the freezing dawn. Instead, Cora simply wiped her hands on her apron, picked up the empty wooden bucket and the iron-headed axe from by the door, and walked out into the bitter cold without another word. Wyatt sat alone in the quiet cabin. He poured himself another cup of chicory. He told himself to let her do it. She needed to learn the brutal realities of this mountain. He had brought a wife to work, not to be coddled. 5 minutes passed, then 10. He cursed violently, slamming his tin cup down on the table. The coffee splashed over the rim, staining the freshly scrubbed wood. He grabbed his heavy canvas coat and pushed out the door. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing the breath from his lungs. The snow had frozen into a hard crust overnight. He followed the fresh, small boot tracks toward the creek. He found her at the edge of the frozen water. She was kneeling on the ice, hacking furiously at the frozen surface with the heavy axe. The tool was too long and too heavy for her. Her swings were wild, driven by pure, desperate frustration rather than technique. The blade bounced off the thick ice, jarring her arms with violent shocks that he could see all the way in her shoulders. "Give me the damn axe!" Wyatt barked, sliding down the snowy bank. Cora spun around, her chest heaving. Her face was flushed, dark red with exertion, and the tip of her nose was raw from the wind. "I can do it!" she panted, raising the heavy iron head again. "You're going to snap your wrists or bury that blade in your knee." Wyatt snarled, closing the distance. He grabbed the handle of the axe just above her grip. For a second they wrestled for it. Her fingers were locked around the wood knuckles, white, refusing to yield. He looked down into her face. Her eyes were furious, swimming with unshed tears of pure anger and humiliation. She hated failing. She hated needing him. "Let it go, Cora," he said, his voice dropping an octave, losing its bark. Slowly her fingers uncurled. She stumbled back a step, wrapping her arms around her thin coat, shivering violently as the sweat on her skin began to freeze. Wyatt turned his back to her. He raised the axe, planting his boots wide, and brought it down in a flawless, devastating arc. The ice shattered with a sound like a gunshot, sending dark, freezing water bubbling up over the frost. He plunged the wooden bucket in, letting it fill the freezing water, soaking his leather gloves. When he hauled the heavy bucket out, he didn't hand it to her. He carried it in his left hand, the axe in his right, and walked back up the bank. "Walk behind me," he ordered, not looking back. "Step in my tracks. The crust is thin over the mud." He heard the crunch of her boots following his exact path. He didn't feel victorious. As he carried the heavy water back to the cabin, the water sloshing against his leg, Wyatt felt a heavy, sinking dread. He had wanted a machine. But the woman walking behind him was bleeding, freezing, and fighting. And worse, he was starting to care. By mid-afternoon, the sky had turned the color of an old bruise. The wind, which had been a steady, annoying whistle all morning, deepened into a hollow roar that shook the heavy timbers of the cabin. Wyatt was sitting by the hearth, meticulously oiling the traps he intended to set along the northern ridge once the weather broke. The smell of gun oil and rust filled his corner of the room, a scent he usually found comforting. Today it was just a distraction. Cora was in motion. She hadn't stopped moving since the incident at the creek. She had boiled water, scrubbed his floorboards with a brutal mixture of sand and lye until her knuckles bled, and washed his spare shirts, hanging them on a line, strung dangerously close to the stove. She was currently attacking a pile of wild root vegetables he had stored in the root cellar, hacking at them with a dull kitchen knife. Wyatt watched her from under the brim of his hat. He noted the way she favored her left shoulder, a lingering soreness from the heavy axe. He noted the way she occasionally stopped to press the heel of her hand against her lower back, her face twisting in a fleeting private grimace before she forced her spine straight again. She was exhausting to watch. Her sheer, unrelenting stubbornness was a loud noise in the quiet room. "You're going to peel the meat right off those roots if you keep hacking at them like that," Wyatt observed casually, wiping excess oil from a steel jaw. Cora didn't look up. "If you sharpened your knives, I wouldn't have to fight the vegetables to the death." Wyatt's jaw tightened. He set the trap down with a metallic clatter. He stood pulling his hunting knife from the leather sheath at his hip. It was 8 inches of carbon steel, honed to a terrifying razor edge. He walked over to the table and slammed the blade down onto the wood point first. It stuck there, quivering slightly. "Use that," he said. Cora stared at the massive weapon embedded in her makeshift cutting board. She looked at Wyatt, her grey eyes flat and unamused. "I'm making a stew, Wyatt, not skinning a bear. It's sharp. Use it." He turned around and walked back to his chair, picking up a rag to hide the sudden strange twitch of a smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. A heavy silence fell over the room, broken only by the whistling wind and the eventual tentative sound of Cora pulling the heavy hunting knife free from the wood. She began chopping again. The rhythm was smoother now, the heavy blade doing the work. Suddenly, a sharp, violent hiss of breath cut through the cabin, followed by the clatter of the knife hitting the floorboards. Wyatt looked up instantly. Cora was clutching her left hand against her chest, her back rigid. Blood was already dripping rapidly onto the scrubbed floorboards, a stark, terrifying red against the pale wood. He didn't think. He was across the room in 3 strides. "Show me." "It's nothing," she gasped, twisting away from him. "I just slipped." "Show me the damn hand, Cora." He didn't wait for her permission. He grabbed her wrist. She flinched, trying to pull away, but his grip was iron. He forced her hand open. The cut was deep, running diagonally across her palm, right over the thick pad of her thumb. It was bleeding heavily, welling up thick and fast. "Sit," he commanded, dragging her toward the chair by the hearth. He pushed her down by the shoulder. "I'm fine." She protested, her voice trembling slightly. Her face had gone entirely white, the exhaustion of the day finally catching up to the sudden shock of pain. "You're bleeding all over my clean floor," he muttered, though the sarcasm fell flat. He knelt in front of her, still holding her wrist. He grabbed a clean rag from his workbench and pressed it hard against the cut. Cora hissed, her eyes squeezed shut, her teeth digging into her bottom lip to keep from making another sound. Wyatt kept the pressure steady. For the first time, he really looked at her hands. He had expected the soft, unblemished skin of a city woman. but her palms were a map of old scars and thick yellow calluses. There were tiny white puncture marks on her fingertips from a needle, but also deep rough patches that spoke of manual labor. Hauling wet wool, scrubbing stone steps. "You lied in your letters," Wyatt said quietly, his voice a low rumble beneath the howling wind outside. Cora opened her eyes, looking down at him. "About what? You said you were a seamstress from a quiet parlor." Wyatt shifted his grip, checking the bleeding. It was slowing. "Soft hands don't have these calluses. Soft women don't swing an axe at frozen ice until their shoulders tear." Cora stared at his dark, weathered hands holding hers. She let out a long, ragged breath, the fight temporarily draining out of her. "I was a seamstress. After I was a laundress. After I hauled coal in the rail yards when I was 12. Her pale eyes met his, completely devoid of shame. "Quiet parlor women don't sell themselves to mountain men for $50, Wyatt. Desperate ones do." The raw honesty hit him in the chest, heavy and uncomfortable. He looked back down at her injured palm. He reached into his pocket with his free hand and pulled out a small tin of yarrow salve kept for minor scrapes on the trail. "Hold still," he murmured. He dabbed the greenish ointment onto the wound. His thumb brushed against the inside of her wrist. He felt her pulse there, fluttering erratically fast and frightened like a snared rabbit. It was a stark reminder of how small she was, how completely at his mercy she was up here in the freezing dark. He felt a sudden terrifying surge of protectiveness, a feeling he hadn't experienced since his hound dog died 5 years ago. He hated it immediately. He bound her hand tightly with a strip of clean linen, tying it off with quick, brutal efficiency. He let go of her wrist and stood up, putting physical distance between them. "Keep it dry," he ordered, walking back to his traps. "I'll finish the vegetables." Cora remained in the chair, cradling her bandaged hand against her chest. She watched his broad back as he picked up the bloody hunting knife, wiped it on his trousers, and began chopping the remaining roots. "Thank you," she said softly into the quiet room. Wyatt didn't turn around. The grip on his knife was so tight his knuckles were white. "Don't thank me." He grumbled the words rougher than he intended. "If your hand gets infected, I don't have a cook." It was the same excuse he had used in the wagon. But this time, as the wind slammed against the heavy logs of the cabin, the excuse sounded incredibly hollow, and they both knew it. The blizzard hit the ridge 2 hours after sundown. It didn't arrive with a gradual thickening of snow. It slammed into the cabin like a runaway freight train. The heavy log walls groaned under the sudden impact. The wind shrieked down the stone chimney, blowing a cloud of grey ash across the freshly scrubbed floorboards. Inside, the temperature plummeted. The perimeter of the room surrendered to the freeze, leaving only a 10-foot radius around the hearth, where the air was even remotely tolerable. The cabin, already small, instantly felt like a cage. Wyatt sat in his chair, a newly oiled trap resting idle across his thighs. He was staring at the fire, but his attention was entirely consumed by the woman sitting across from him. Cora was mending, or trying to. She had a heavy canvas grain sack draped over her knees, attempting to stitch a tear with a thick iron needle. But she only had one good hand. The other, swathed in Wyatt's rough linen bandage, rested awkwardly in her lap. She was using her knees to pin the stiff fabric, driving the needle through the canvas with her right hand, then awkwardly trying to pull the heavy thread tight, using her teeth and the very tips of her bandaged fingers. It was agonizing to watch. Every third stitch she would bite her lip, her shoulders stiffening as the raw cut on her palm protested. "Put it down," Wyatt said. His voice sounded loud, cutting through the hollow roar of the wind. Cora didn't look up. She bit the thread, pulling it taut with a sharp jerk of her head. "It needs doing. You use this sack for the mule's oats. It's leaking. The mules aren't eating out of it tonight. Put it down. If I don't do it now, it won't be ready when the storm breaks." She jammed the needle back into the canvas. Her hand slipped. The eye of the needle dug sharply into her bandaged thumb. She dropped the sack with a sharp intake of breath, cradling her injured hand against her ribs. She curled into herself, her chin dropping to her chest. She didn't make a sound, but Wyatt saw the rapid, shallow rise and fall of her shoulders. He set the trap on the floor. He stood up, crossing the small space between them in 2 strides. He didn't ask. He reached down, grabbed the heavy canvas sack, and pulled it off her lap. He tossed it onto the table. "I told you to put it down," he said, his voice dropping into that low, dangerous rumble. Cora finally looked up. Her grey eyes were bright and entirely feral. It wasn't the look of a woman afraid of a man's temper. It was the look of a cornered animal, terrified of the consequences of its own uselessness. "I can work," she said, her voice shaking with an intensity that caught him off guard. "It's just a cut. I've worked through worse. I hauled wet sheets in December with cracked ribs. I can sew a damn sack." Wyatt stared down at her. The anger drained out of him, replaced by a cold, sudden clarity. He understood then. She wasn't just being stubborn. She was surviving. In her world, a broken tool was discarded. A worker who couldn't pull her weight was thrown out into the alley. She looked at him and saw an employer evaluating a damaged investment. She fully expected him to toss her out into the blizzard if she didn't prove her worth. The realization made him physically sick. He pulled up a 3-legged milking stool and sat down heavily right in front of her, their knees nearly touching. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his thighs. He forced her to look at him, keeping his expression entirely neutral. "Look around, Cora," he said quietly. She blinked, her brow furrowing. She didn't move her head. "Look at this place," he insisted, sweeping a large hand toward the dark corners of the cabin. "Look at me. Do I look like a rail yard foreman? Do I look like a St. Louis parlor, madam?" She stared at his face, at the jagged scar running through his left eyebrow, the deep lines of isolation bracketing his mouth. "No," she whispered. "I bought a wife. I didn't buy a mule." The word felt strange in his mouth, heavy and permanent. "You split your hand open trying to do my work with my dull tools. That's on me. You're not going to starve because you can't sew a grain sack for 3 days. You're not going back down the mountain. The transaction is over." Cora stared at him, searching his eyes for the lie. She was looking for the catch, the hidden cost. When she found none, the rigid tension holding her spine straight suddenly snapped. She slumped back into the chair, letting out a long, ragged exhale. She closed her eyes, the firelight catching the damp sheen on her pale cheeks. "The stew is burning," she mumbled, her voice thick. "I'll stir it," Wyatt said. He stood up. He walked to the stove, grabbed the long wooden spoon, and began scraping the bottom of the heavy Dutch oven. The smell of wild onions and venison rose in a thick cloud. He listened to the wind tearing at the roof. He listened to the quiet, exhausted sound of Cora's breathing behind him. He had spent 7 years cultivating silence, building a wall of ice and stone to keep the world out. But as he ladled the hot stew into 2 tin bowls, he realized the wall was already gone. He didn't want the silence anymore. He wanted the rust, the blood, and the fight. By dawn on the 3rd day, the shrieking wind died. The sudden absence of noise was jarring, heavy enough to ring in the ears. Wyatt kicked the heavy oak door open. It took 3 brutal shoves of his shoulder to break through the snowdrift that had packed against the wood. The sunlight hit him like a physical blow, blinding and pristine. The world had been erased. The jagged pine trees were buried under thick, suffocating mounds of white, and the air was so cold it burned the back of his throat like raw whiskey. He grabbed his snowshoes from the peg by the door. "Stay inside," he called back into the cabin. "Keep the fire stoked. I'm checking the stock." Cora was standing by the stove, nursing a cup of black coffee. She looked better. 2 days of forced rest had brought a fraction of color back to her cheeks, though she still favored her bandaged hand. She didn't argue, just gave a short nod. Wyatt strapped on the snowshoes and began the brutal slog towards the lean-to. The snow was powdery and deep, fighting every step. The silence of the morning was quickly broken by a terrifying sound, a sharp, splintering crack that echoed like a rifle shot across the valley. Wyatt swore loudly. He pushed harder, his thighs burning as he crested the drift hiding the shelter. The lean-to was buckling. The weight of 3 feet of wet snow on the slanted roof was too much for the old timber. One of the main support beams, a thick pine trunk, had bowed inward, a deep, jagged split opening along its center. Inside the shelter, Jasper and Clementine were thrashing. The smell of their panic, hot ammonia and sweat cut through the freezing air. If the roof collapsed, it would crush them instantly. Without the mules, Wyatt couldn't haul timber. He couldn't haul pelts. Without the mules, they were trapped up here until the spring thaw. "Hold steady," Wyatt bellowed, slipping into the dark, enclosed space. He grabbed a spare, unpeeled log he kept stacked in the corner for firewood. It was 8 feet long and thicker than his thigh. He wedged one end into the frozen dirt floor, leaning his massive weight against it, trying to wedge the other end under the buckling roof beam to act as a brace. It was too heavy. The angle was wrong. His boots slipped on the icy manure covering the floor. He shoved upward, a raw grunt of exertion tearing from his chest. The main beam let out another agonizing groan, sagging an inch lower. Wood dust rained down on his shoulders. He needed leverage. He needed another pair of hands. He was completely alone. Then a shadow blocked the blinding glare of the doorway. Wyatt turned his head, his teeth bared in a grimace of strain. Cora was standing there. She hadn't put on her snowshoes. She was knee-deep in the snow, wearing his oversized canvas coat, her rusted hair hanging loose around her shoulders. "Get out!" Wyatt roared. "It's going to come down." She didn't freeze. She didn't scream. She assessed the geometry of the failing roof, the slipping brace, and Wyatt's strained posture in 2 seconds. She waded into the shelter, the snow falling off her boots. "The base is slipping," she shouted over the braying of the mules. "You push up. I'll kick the base in." "Your hand." "Forget my damn hand, Wyatt, push." Wyatt didn't have the breath to argue. The beam cracked again. He dug his boots into the frozen dirt, locked his knees, and shoved upward with everything he had. The muscles in his back burned, feeling like they were tearing off the bone. Cora dropped to her knees in the filth. She wedged her shoulder against the bottom of the heavy prop log. Using her good hand to grip the icy bark, she drove her heavy leather boot violently into the base of the log. "Again!" she yelled, her voice ragged. Wyatt pushed. Cora kicked. The log slid an inch. "Again!" Wyatt roared, a primal sound of absolute exertion, driving his shoulder into the wood. Cora slammed her boot into the base one final time. The log slid into place, wedging tightly between the frozen earth and the sagging roof beam. The horrible creaking stopped. The roof held. Wyatt staggered back, gasping for air. His chest heaved, his lungs burning from the icy air and the massive strain. He leaned back against the rough wall of the shelter, wiping sweat from his forehead with a trembling, leather-gloved hand. Cora was still on the floor. She was sitting in the frozen dirt, her knees pulled up, gasping. Her hat had fallen off, and she was covered in sawdust and mule hair. She looked at her bandaged hand. The white linen was stained with fresh, bright red blood. She had reopened the wound. Wyatt's heart hammered against his ribs. He crossed the small space and dropped to one knee beside her. He didn't ask if she was all right. He didn't offer a platitude. He reached out and gently gripped her wrist, examining the blood seeping through the linen. He looked up from her bleeding hand to her face. She was exhausted, filthy, and entirely magnificent. "You're an idiot." He breathed, his voice rough. A slow, tired smirk pulled at the corner of Cora's pale mouth. "I saved your roof, Mountain Man. You're welcome." Wyatt stared at her. The cynical, hardened shell he had worn for 7 years cracked right down the middle, just like the pine beam above them. He realized he hadn't just bought a survivor. He had bought a partner. He let go of her wrist instead, sliding his large, calloused hand to the back of her neck, pulling her forward. He rested his forehead against hers. He didn't kiss her. It wasn't the time for it. It was just a brutal, honest connection in the freezing dark. Yeah. He whispered against her skin. I guess you did. The adrenaline which had burned so hot and bright in the freezing lean-to vanished the second they crossed the threshold of the cabin. It left behind a brutal, bone-deep exhaustion that made Wyatt's hands shake as he forced the heavy door shut against the snow. Cora didn't walk to the fire. She stood in the center of the room, water pooling around her boots, staring blankly at the rusted stove. Her teeth were chattering so violently he could hear the sharp clack of enamel. She was completely drained, her body finally surrendering to the shock of the cold, the exertion, and the torn flesh of her hand. Wyatt stripped off his gloves with his teeth and threw them on the table. Get the coat off, he ordered, his voice lacking its usual thunder. He sounded ragged. She fumbled with the heavy horn buttons of his canvas coat, but her fingers refused to cooperate. Her right hand was trembling, and her left was dripping fresh blood onto the floorboards. She let out a frustrated, pathetic sound, a trapped noise at the back of her throat. Wyatt stepped into her space, batting her hands away. He didn't ask. He unbuttoned the stiff canvas and peeled it off her shoulders. The wool dress underneath was damp with melted snow and sweat. He could feel the violent tremors racking her spine. Sit down, he muttered, pushing her gently by the shoulder toward the pallet of bearskins near the hearth. Cora collapsed onto the furs, curling her knees to her chest. She wrapped her right arm around her ribs, shivering uncontrollably. Wyatt didn't stop moving. He threw 3 massive logs onto the dying embers, pumping the bellows until the fire roared up the chimney, casting frantic, jumping shadows across the log walls. He grabbed his iron kettle, filled it from the bucket, and slammed it onto the stove. Only then did he kneel beside her. Let me see it, he demanded, reaching for her left hand. Cora flinched, pulling it tighter against her chest. It's just bleeding. It'll stop. It's full of mule shit and sawdust, Cora. Give it to me. He didn't wait for her to relent. He gripped her wrist. She hissed as he unwrapped the blood-soaked linen. The cut had torn open wider than before, the edges raw and angry. But it wasn't just the blood that worried him. Her skin felt completely wrong. Her fingers were ice-cold, yet the palm radiated a sickly, dry heat. He looked at her face. Her pale grey eyes were glassy, unfocused, staring at the collar of his shirt instead of his face. A harsh, unnatural flush stained her cheekbones, stark against the waxy pallor of the rest of her skin. The cold hadn't just settled in her bones, it had invited a fever. Wyatt swore viciously under his breath. He stood, grabbed a clean basin, and poured in a splash of raw whiskey from a jug he kept hidden under his bunk, followed by boiling water from the kettle. He tossed in a handful of dried yarrow. The cabin instantly smelled of sharp alcohol and bitter weeds. He knelt back down, dipping a clean rag into the scalding mixture. This is going to burn, he warned flatly. He didn't sugarcoat it, and he didn't go slow. He scrubbed the raw wound, flushing out the dirt and the filth. Cora didn't scream, but her entire body arched off the furs. She clamped her jaw so tight he thought he heard a tooth crack, a low, guttural moan tearing from her throat. Her right hand shot out, grabbing his forearm. Her fingernails dug into his skin with shocking strength, fighting the pain. Wyatt kept his hand steady, ignoring her grip. His face set in a grim, immovable mask. Inside, a cold spike of panic was driving itself into his gut. Up here, a fever was a death sentence. Infection was a reaper. He bound the hand again, wrapping it tight in clean cotton. He fetched a heavy wool blanket from his own bed and threw it over her trembling frame. By nightfall, the violent shivering stopped, replaced by a terrifying, stagnant heat. Cora lay on the bearskins, tossing her head weakly from side to side. The cabin was sweltering, the fire built so high it threatened to crack the chimney stones, yet she complained of the ice. Wyatt sat on the three-legged stool beside her, completely abandoning his traps, his hides, and his routine. He held a damp cloth, wiping the sticky sweat from her forehead and the hollow of her neck. The lye soap smell of her was gone, replaced by the sour copper scent of sickness. She began to mumble. The words were disjointed, dragged up from the dark, ugly corners of her memory. "Don't dock the pay." She whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "I caught the thread. I caught it. Mr. Higgins, I caught it." Wyatt dipped the rag in cold water, wringing it out. "Quiet down, Cora," he murmured, laying the cloth over her eyes. She didn't hear him. Her good hand grabbed fistfuls of the wool blanket, twisting it ruthlessly. "The coal is too heavy. The bucket is dragging. Tell them I can pull it." A tear leaked from the corner of her eye, tracking through the grime on her cheek. "I'm not useless. Don't leave me in the alley." The words hit Wyatt like physical blows. He stared down at her, seeing the absolute crushing weight of her entire life distilled into a fever dream. She had never known an ounce of grace. She had only known transaction exhaustion and survival. He reached out his massive, calloused hand, enveloping her thrashing right hand. He pinned it gently to her chest, holding it there with steady, immovable pressure. "You're not in the alley," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly, resonant anchor in the quiet room. "You're on the mountain. Nobody's docking your pay." He sat there for 10 hours. He kept the fire roaring. He forced drops of water between her cracked lips. He listened to the wind howling against the timber, a sound that had been his only companion for 7 years. But as he watched the shallow, laboured rise and fall of her chest, Wyatt realized with a terrifying certainty that if the silence returned tomorrow, it would kill him. The smell woke her. It was heavy bitter and entirely ruined. Cora forced her eyes open. Her eyelids felt like they had been scrubbed with sand. The harsh morning sunlight was knifing through the single frost-caked window of the cabin, painting a glaring white square on the floorboards. Her mouth tasted like copper and old ash. She tried to swallow, but her throat was swollen shut. She shifted her weight, intending to sit up, and the world immediately tilted on a violent axis. Her muscles felt like water entirely devoid of strength, and a sharp throbbing ache pulsed in time with her heartbeat from her left hand. She let out a dry, pathetic cough and collapsed back onto the bearskins. "Stop moving." The voice came from the corner of the room. Wyatt was sitting at the table. He looked terrible. His thick hair was matted, his jaw dark, with 3 days of rough stubble, and his clothes looked like he had slept in them because he had. The table in front of him was a chaotic mess of tin cups, a half-empty jug of whiskey, and bloodied rags. Cora stared at him, trying to piece the fractured memories together. The snow, the beam, the fire, the burning rag. "How long?" she croaked. Her voice sounded like 2 dry rocks grinding together. Wyatt stood up. His joints popped loudly in the quiet cabin. 2 days, he said flatly. He walked to the stove. The terrible smell was coming from an iron pot resting on the hot iron. He grabbed a rag, picked up the pot, and poured a thick, greyish liquid into a tin cup. He walked over to her, his heavy boots lacking their usual forceful stride. He looked exhausted down to the marrow. He knelt beside the pallet, sliding a thick arm beneath her shoulders. He didn't ask if she wanted help. He hauled her upright, bracing her back against his broad chest. His body heat was absolute, seeping through her thin dress and the heavy wool blanket. "Drink?" he ordered, bringing the tin cup to her lips. Cora took a sip and gagged. It was a vile mixture of bone broth salt and something that tasted distinctly like tree bark. She tried to turn her head away. "I said drink it." Wyatt repeated his grip on her shoulder, tightening just enough to be immovable. "You sweat out half your weight. You need the salt." She glared at him, a flicker of her old feral defiance sparking in her grey eyes, but she lacked the strength to fight. She choked down 3 more swallows of the foul liquid, before leaning her head back against his collarbone, completely spent. She looked around the cabin from her new vantage point. It was a disaster. The floor she had scrubbed until her knuckles bled was tracked with mud and ash. The clean shirts she had washed were crumpled in a pile on the chair. The unwashed skillet sat on the stove, slick with congealed grease. A sharp spike of panic hit her chest. "The chores," she whispered, her breathing picking up her eyes wide. "The floor. I have to." She tried to push herself out of his grip, her right hand scrabbling against the furs. "Sit still." Wyatt barked, his voice cracking like a whip. Cora froze her shoulders tense, waiting for the reprimand. Waiting for him to tell her she was a burden. Waiting for the transaction to be cancelled. Wyatt let out a long, heavy exhale, the anger instantly draining out of him, leaving behind something raw and uncomfortable. He gently lowered her back onto the pallet, pulling the blanket up to her chin. He didn't stand up. He stayed on one knee, his large hands resting on his thighs. "The chores are dead, Cora," he said, his voice dropping into that quiet, terrifyingly honest register. "The floor is dirty. The skillet is dirty. I don't give a damn. I have to work," she insisted, her voice trembling, a desperate edge to her words. "You paid $50. I have to earn my keep. If I can't work, I don't—" She swallowed hard, the old fears of the rail yards and the freezing alleys suffocating her. "I don't have anywhere else to go." Wyatt stared at her. He reached out his rough thumb, brushing a damp strand of rust-colored hair away from her forehead. The gesture was shockingly gentle for a man of his size. "Do you think I dragged you out of that snowstorm to mop my floor?" he asked softly. Cora blinked, the exhaustion making it hard to track his logic. "You wanted a cook. I wanted a ghost." Wyatt corrected, his eyes locking onto hers, dark and unblinking. "I wanted someone to boil the water and stay out of my way, but you didn't do that. You came in here and started fighting the damn ice with an axe. You kicked a support beam while a roof was falling on your head." He leaned closer, the smell of wood smoke and old coffee clinging to his skin. "You don't owe me labor for breathing, Cora. The debt is paid. It was paid the second you put your shoulder under that log to save my mules. I don't want a maid anymore." Cora stared at him, her chest tight. The cynical armor she had worn since she was 12 years old was cracking, splitting open under the sheer weight of his honesty. She didn't know how to navigate this. She only knew transaction. She only knew survival. "Then what do you want?" she whispered, terrified of the answer. Wyatt looked at her pale face, at the jagged, imperfect reality of her. He let his hand slide from her hair to rest heavily against the side of her neck, his thumb resting over the frantic, bird-like flutter of her pulse. "I want you to heal your damn hand," he said roughly, his thumb stroking her skin, once a quiet promise of warmth in the bitter cold. "And then I want you to teach me how to make a biscuit that doesn't taste like an iron wedge." The mountain didn't surrender to spring all at once. It gave up the winter in ugly, violent fits of mud and freezing rain. The constant maddening sound of water dripping off the eaves replaced the howling wind. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the smell of wet wool, melting snow, and baking yeast. 6 weeks had passed since the fever broke. Wyatt sat at the scarred wooden table, a heavy leather awl in his right hand. He was punching new holes into Jasper's harness. The leather was stiff-smelling sharply of neat's foot oil and old sweat. He drove the iron spike through the thick hide with a grunt of effort, twisting it to widen the gap. Across the room, Cora was kneading dough. He stopped working, letting the heavy harness drop to his lap. He watched her. She wasn't wearing the severe practical knot anymore. Her rust-red hair hung in a thick braid down her back, the frayed end brushing against her waist with every violent push of her palms into the dough. She was wearing one of his old oversized flannel shirts, the sleeves rolled up past her elbows. She favored her left hand. The bandage was gone, replaced by a thick, angry pink scar that slashed diagonally across her palm. It pulled tight when she stretched her fingers, a permanent puckered map of the mountain's violence. But she didn't stop using it. She drove her weight into the dough, folding, pressing, punishing the flour and water until it surrendered into a smooth, elastic ball. She slammed the dough into a greased iron bowl, wiping a smudge of flour from her forehead with the back of her wrist. She turned around, catching him staring. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. The pale, washed-out grey of her eyes had darkened over the last month, the feral panic completely replaced by something steady and unnervingly direct. "You're going to snap that all if you keep holding it like a murder weapon?" she said. Her voice still had that dry, raspy edge, but it wasn't a defense mechanism anymore. It was just her. Wyatt looked down at his hand. He was gripping the wooden handle so tightly his knuckles were bone white. He set the tool down with a dull clatter. He stood up the chair, scraping loudly against the uneven floorboards. He walked across the small room. The space between them, which used to feel like a battlefield, now felt dangerously small. He stopped right in front of her, the heat radiating off the iron stove wrapped around them both. "Give me the hand," he said quietly. Cora's jaw tightened for a fraction of a second, a ghost of her old instincts. But she didn't argue. She raised her left hand covered in a fine dusting of white flour and placed it palm up in his massive, calloused grip. Wyatt didn't look at her face. He looked at the scar. He traced the jagged pink ridge with his thumb, wiping away the flour. His touch was painstakingly slow, a heavy, rough friction against her sensitive skin. "Does it pull?" he asked, his voice a low rumble in his chest. "Only when the weather turns cold," she answered. Her breath hitched slightly, an involuntary physical reaction to the heat of his thumb dragging across the sensitive nerve endings. "It's ugly," he stated, a matter-of-fact observation. "I've got a dozen uglier," she fired back, her chin tilting up. "I told you I'm not a parlor ornament, Wyatt. I'm built for the dirt." Wyatt finally looked up from her palm. He met her eyes. The cynical armor he had worn for 7 years was completely gone, stripped away by the shared terror of the ice and the fever. He didn't see a maid. He didn't see a transaction. He saw the only thing that had ever managed to plant its feet in his frozen wasteland and refuse to die. "I know what you're built for," he breathed. He didn't let go of her hand. He used it to pull her forward. The kiss wasn't gentle. It wasn't a hesitant romantic sweep. It was a collision. Wyatt's mouth crashed down on hers, desperate and starving. He backed her up against the edge of the heavy wooden counter, his large hands dropping her scarred palm, to grip her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. The impact rattled the tin cups resting on the shelf. Cora gasped against his mouth, a sharp sound of shock that instantly melted into absolute roaring participation. She didn't melt into him. She fought back. Her hands tangled in his thick, overgrown hair, her short fingernails scraping against his scalp. She tasted like black coffee and salt. He tasted like leather and the sharp tang of winter air. It was clumsy. It was rough. Their teeth clicked together as they shifted angles, both of them moving with the frantic urgency of people who had been freezing to death their entire lives and had finally found the fire. Wyatt shoved a heavy iron skillet out of the way with his elbow, the metal shrieking against the wood to pull her closer. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the lye soap and the warm, living scent of her skin. He let out a harsh, ragged breath that sounded almost like a groan. "You're staying," he muttered against her collarbone, his voice thick and demanding. It wasn't a question. Cora wrapped her arms tightly around his broad shoulders, her scarred hand pressing into the heavy muscles of his back. She felt the violent, erratic pounding of his heart against her ribs. She closed her eyes, the last lingering ghosts of the St. Louis rail yards and the freezing alleys burning away into ash. "I'm staying!" she whispered fiercely. "Try to throw me out, Mountain Man. See what happens." Wyatt pulled back just enough to look at her. A slow, genuine grin, a rare, startling expression, that completely altered the harsh landscape of his face, broke through his beard. He leaned his forehead against hers, the chaotic rhythm of their breathing filling the small cabin. Outside, the ice was cracking, giving way to the mud and the pines. But inside, standing amidst the flour, the leather and the heavy iron, the winter was permanently dead. The mountain had finally been claimed. And that brings our untamed journey to an end. If Wyatt and Cora's fierce, hard-fought romance set your heart racing, don't leave without hitting that like button. Let us know in the comments below what your favorite moment was. Did you love the raw tension, or that explosive, deeply earned ending? Share this video with fellow fans of gritty emotional storytelling, and make sure to subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell. We have so many more incredible, grounded stories waiting for you. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next wild adventure.